So, what is networking? Well, networking or a network is two or more devices that is connected and can thereby communicate with each other. And that is really what we're going to focus on in this entire course, that we have multiple devices that are able to talk to each other. So we're going to look at how such can happen. And when we say networking, it might sound kinda simple, because when we say, oh, we are just communicating over a network, or we are just sending information, but you can compare it to shipping. When you're talking about shipping, that also sounds very simple, but when you dive into the different aspects of shipping a parcel, as we see in the picture right here, there are so many different steps that someone has to take care of before the package gets from the shop where you bought it to your front door. And it is the same with networking. Whenever we are doing something online, there is a lot of steps that is happening behind the scene, and that can be broken down to the OSI model, which we are going to talk about in this lecture. So, the OSI model, this is the network model that is defining all the aspects that are happening when we are doing communication over a network, and it consists of 7 layers. So we have layer 1, the physical layer, which is the lowest layer and the lowest level, where we have the electric bytes and cables, whereas we have layer 7, which is the application, meaning the application and front end that you're interacting with, which is the highest level. And then we have these different layers in between. So before we get into the different layers, it's more important that we understand how this OSI model actually works. So even though that we now know there are these several layers, it's important to see how this is working in practice. So for example, if we have computer A right here and computer B right here, then a person on computer A is going to send something to computer B. He is starting on the application layer, and then he is working, or the computer and the electronics within his computer is working its way down from application layer all the way down to the different layers until it reach the physical layer, and then it is going to be transferred over to computer B, which is starting from the lowest layer and then working its way up until it is capable of presenting the data that computer A sent. So this is how the OSI model works. It starts from the top in the one end all the way down, and it goes from the bottom up in the other end to them. So we have the first layer, which is the physical layer. And as I mentioned before, this is the lowest level. So this is cable and bytes. It is here we have the electric voltages happening, and it is here we have our network interface card, and it is also here we have our cables. So this is on the very basics, where it is not code anymore, but electric impulses that is getting transferred through the cable. Then we have the layer 2, which is the data link layer, and this is where we package our bytes into frames, and it is also in this layer that we have our MAC addresses on our computer, which is a unique address that is hard coded into your network card, meaning that compared to an IP address, is something that you can change whenever you want. You cannot change your MAC address. You can do MAC address spoofing, but that is a totally another thing. But again, you can simply change this. So this is the layer 2, where we are using MAC addresses if we are going to communicate. Then we have the layer 3, which is one step above, and this is where we get introduced to the IP addresses. Whereas before in layer 2 relied on MAC addresses, we are now using IP addresses. So an IP address is really a logical address, and it is therefore not hard coded. So it is something that can be changed when we are in need of a new one, and therefore it is not a unique address, because either it can be changed on your local machine internally within a network, or your internet service provider can change it in their setup. So it is not something that is hard coded. And it is also this layer that is doing the network routing. So whenever you are using a router, for example, that is a layer 3 device, because it is distributing packages based on the different IPs, and it is sorting who is going to get what based on the IP addresses on the packages that is going to be transferred. Then we have the layer 4, which is the transport layer. This is the manage and control layer, where we are starting to see different ways of transferring information. For example, we have the TCP and UDP, which is two different protocols. For the TCP, we are in need of getting identified and verified that our data is reaching our target. So if we are using a TCP protocol, whenever we are sending something out, we need to get a response back saying, I got this package, send me a new one. But if we use UDP, which is the one that is most likely being used on all streaming services and especially YouTube, we are just throwing packages as, through towards our target, and we don't really care if they receive them in the right order. We are just spamming them with data, because if we needed a confirmation for each packages, then the load time will be tremendous, and that is not really smart. So this is in the layer 4 that we are dealing with these two different protocols, and it is also where we are splitting the communication that is coming from the layers above layer 4 down into these packages. Then we have the layer 5, which is the session layer. This is the layer that is controlling our traffic, meaning that it is the layer that is establishing, and it is managing, and it is terminating our connection. And it also coordinates this communication and take charge of how much we are allowed to send and when we are allowed to send it. So whenever you are going online, it is the layer 4 that is taking charge of establishing the connection when you are getting connected to something online. And it is also the layer 5 that is in charge of terminating this connection, so that we don't have thousands of connections when we are done using them. Then we have the layer 6, which is the presentation layer. This is the layer that is right below the application layer. So this is where our data is getting transformed into a format that our application can understand. So for example, when we have some packages that got sent to us, it is the layer 6 that is transferring it into, for example, XML, or doing encryption or decryption on it before it is presented in the application. So the last layer, layer 7, the application layer, this is where our data is presented, and this is where we are getting access from our application to the network. And this can happen over HTTP, FTP, SMTP, based on what we are going to do, if it's mail, simply web browsing, or file transfer. So this was a quick overlook of the 7 layers in the OSI model. In the next lectures we will dig deeper into each of them along the way to understand this complex area of networking.